Yes, well, thank you very much to the European Movement for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. Fantastic that you're here. And just really to continue where Nick left off, really, this sense that this is a major conversation that is going to really affect the future of all of our lives, and that there is not one single big crisis that we face today that is going to be made any easier by trying to tackle it on our own. And I think it's important to say as well that the EU does need to be reformed. I don't think any of us up here are saying that the EU is perfect. Nick and I have seen it up close, as has Shirley and others. And we know that, yes, it needs to be reformed, but you need to be there to change it, number one. And number two, you know what, Westminster needs to be reformed as well. But I don't see many on the other side saying they're all going to march out of Westminster and out of the UK because we don't like the way Westminster works. No, you stay in it to change it and to reform it. And I must say, when it comes to the whole discussions about how democratic the EU is, yes, I want it to be more democratic and more accountable, but to be lectured on that by Tory MPs who are in a government elected on 24% of the vote seems to me a little bit... And I want to make sure that we make a distinction between some of the flaws of the EU institutions on the one hand and some of the neoliberal policies of right-wing governments on the other, because they are not the same thing. So when we discuss the EU, I think it's really important to make that distinction between some of the policies we don't like on the one hand and the fact of the need for those institutions on the other. And of course, if there's any issue that really illustrates this more than any other, it probably is TTIP, that famous Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership Treaty. And for those of us who are not very enamoured of this treaty, not least because it sets up the ability for private corporations to sue democratically elected governments if they don't like what those governments think of as perhaps health and safety regulation, but as far as the corporations are concerned, this is nasty red tape that they need to get rid of. You know, that is a good reason to be against TTIP. But the best way to fight TTIP is precisely by fighting it in the EU, where we've already seen 250,000 people marching on the streets of Berlin. We've seen 3 million people across the EU sign a petition against TTIP. We've seen the French government actually now threatening to block TTIP as well. The bottom line is that we can stop TTIP tomorrow if we persuade our members of the European Parliament to do that. That is what democracy is about. But to complain about TTIP and therefore think that's a good reason to leave the EU is just so misguided. Because you know who was one of the biggest cheerleaders of TTIP? It is David Cameron himself. And if anybody thinks that by withdrawing from the EU we're going to end up with a lovely, cuddly, friendly trade policy, let me disabuse you now. We are not, because that same investor-state dispute settlement mechanism will be inserted in any bilateral trade agreement that successive governments are likely to introduce. So the point is to stay in the EU and to fight for what we believe in, not to ditch those institutions, to make the distinction, knowing that if you put right-wing policies into the EU, because right now there's a majority of right-wing governments at the Council of Ministers, then you get right-wing policies out of the EU. That is not a problem of the EU, it is a problem of the policies that are going in. The same thing when it comes to the common agricultural policy, the common fisheries policy. Lots of things I'd like to see improved on those, although they are going in the right direction. But the problem with them is not the fact that they're common. The problem is with some of the policies that are being enacted. And that comes right back to us in our own country, as it comes back to the people of many other countries around the EU to be fighting to make sure we have more progressive governments representing us in the EU. But please don't think that is a reason to be walking away from the EU. Now, I'm not going to talk about the economics very much because you will hear the economic arguments every time you turn your radio on, every time you put the TV on, every time you open your newspaper. And frankly, I think it's beginning to bore most of us. I think it's very clear, broadly speaking, that we're going to be better off in financially. But I want to talk about the ways we're better off in other ways as well, because I worry that we're not going to be able to reach so many people who actually want a kind of a values-based reason to stay in the EU. They don't want just a narrow transactional calculation about how much we put in and how much we get out. They want to know that their identity and their kids' future and their friends are going to be part of an outward-looking, confident Britain, not one that is turning its back on others and trying to solve problems on its own. And I think if we need any issue that demonstrates that more than any other, it is the issue of the environment. We know that environmental problems are by their very nature cross-border. They don't wait politely to have their passports checked at borders. They cross borders. And so air pollution that blights many of our cities in this country, for example, Now, some of that air pollution is coming across from France and other countries. And so we are going to need cross-border solutions to solve those problems. Climate change is the example beyond all others. How could Britain possibly be serious about trying to tackle climate change on its own? And there I have to say, in parenthesis, there really is quite an interesting crossover between those who are Eurosceptic on the one side and climate skeptic actually on the same side. There is a very big crossover there, and that's because people just don't really like regulation. They don't like any rules. They don't like something that is telling them that we need to change our direction. But if anybody believes, as sometimes the Brexit campaigners will say, that our environment is safe in their hands if we leave the EU, then let me just suggest politely that they've not been paying very much attention. You know, this is a Prime Minister who is telling us that he wants to ditch the green crap. It's the Chancellor who is saying that some of the most precious protections of our nature that we have, the Birds Directive and the Habitats Directive, are unwanted red tape that he wants to get rid of as well. The environment is not safe in the hands of this government, or I would argue successive governments, and we need European rules to be able to address that. I can see out of the corner of my eye that Laura's looking a little bit twitchy, so let me just finish with one last point. And this is not the point that David Cameron has been mocked for saying, and I think he's been wrongly quoted, but it is a point about peace, because I genuinely think that we take for granted the peace that the EU has helped to bring us at our peril. That this has not been a traditionally very peaceful continent. And I'd suggest to you that the EU is not some abstract project born in the Brussels think tanks. This project was born of the bones and the bodies of people who died in 2 ferocious world wars. And I think we forget that at our peril, I really do. And that is not to say I think World War III is around the corner, but it is to say that there was a very good reason for creating the EU in such a way to make sure that war in the future is not only unthinkable, but impossible. And we have had 70 years of peace. I'm not saying the EU is the only reason for that peace, but it has played a really important role. And I think that as we move forward into an increasingly uncertain world, to throw that away would be incredibly, incredibly irresponsible.